Hello, Fräulein!
O Gott im Himmel, rette uns vor der bösen Katholiken. Bringe deinen Zorn auf sie. Bring uns.
Der Löwen aus Mitternacht.
Wer ist das? Stirb, du verdammte Ketzer!
Der Germane, ja, das war ein Held. Darum hat man ihm auch ein Denkmal aufgestellt.
The name Gustav bears great power. In ancient Norse, it means staff of the Goths. From a more Latin angle, it was interpreted as Augustus, ruler of the world. On the 9th of December, 1594, a child was born in the Palace of Stockholm, Gustav Adolf. In 36 years, the child would decide the fate of Europe. His countrymen would name him the Great, but to the Protestant world he would forever be called Der Löwe aus Mitternacht, Lion of the North. But at the time there was no evidence of greatness. He was born in the palace out of pure coincidence. His father, Charles, was only a duke. Sweden was ruled by Gustavus' cousin, Sigismund. Sigismund was also the king of Poland and a Catholic. Most of Sweden was Protestant, though the last king of Sweden had made attempts to reconcile the two religions. This didn't work out too well. Charles himself was a devout Calvinist and did everything to challenge Sigismund's power. The conflict escalated into a short civil war in which Sigismund was deposed. Duke Charles was made King Charles IX and was forever remembered for having the weirdest hairstyle in Swedish history.
Look at the top of his head!
Prince Gustavus was now heir to the throne and already showed signs of greatness. When out on a stroll in the garden, Daddy Charlie warned him of snakes. "Give me a stick," said the prince, "and I'll kill him." In another incident, the prince was gifted a small horse by a peasant, but the generous young prince opened his purse, telling the peasant that he needed the money. Of course, these anecdotes were only ever told by his half-brother and possibly invented, but the prince received an excellent education. He was taught everything from music to mechanics, astronomy and law. He loved the military and became an excellent speaker. Languages he learned included but were not limited to Latin, Dutch and French. He naturally spoke Swedish but also German, since his mother was from Holstein-Gottorp. Later he would learn bits of Scottish, Russian and Polish. During his youth he was tall, fit and strong. History was very important to Gustavus, and he was very proud of his own lineage. He believed he was the 148th in a long line of Swedish kings dating back to a biblical monster called Magog. You see, whilst most Europeans larped as the successors of Rome, the Swedes embraced themselves as the descendants of the warlike Goths that had brought down the Roman Empire. During his Baroque coronation in 1617, Gustavus attended a tournament where he played the part of Berik, a mythical king of Sweden that had conquered Pomerania, Poland, Mecklenburg, and the mystical Almerugia. Naturally, this gave Gustavus a righteous claim to rule those modern territories. Gothicism formed a major part of Gustavus' warlike identity, and that of his entire nobility. In 1611, things weren't looking good. Sweden was at war with Denmark, Russia and Poland, all at the same time. But King Charles believed in his son, saying, "He'll fix it." Then he died. The Kalmar War against Denmark had quickly deteriorated into a war of attrition, where both sides sought to undermine the enemy's ability to replenish. Villages were massacred and fields burnt. It was plunder and ethnic cleansing. Gustavus partook in the violence himself. In a letter to his half-brother, he bragged how he had murdered the Danes and burned their parishes. Since the war was going nowhere for either side, peace was signed in 1613. Sweden was forced to pay a heavy ransom for the fort of Elfsborg, located near modern Gothenburg. It would take 6 years of intense taxation to pay back the tribute, and the king himself was forced to melt down his silverware. Things couldn't go on like this. Gustavus realized that Sweden needed three things: money, a proper military, and more money. But Gustavus knew that nothing could be achieved without cooperation. This was arguably his best personality trait. He himself said that the fatherland is strong when the country stands united. He didn't have to look very far for help. As soon as Daddy died, he was approached by the nobility and given an offer he could not refuse. Okay, so the Swedish state created by Gustavus' grandfather, Gustav Vasa, was incredibly centralized and bureaucratic for its day. However, the nobility had pretty much been excluded from participation. Now they wanted more power in the state apparatus. Only they would occupy high positions. Gustavus couldn't fire them without due process, nor institute new laws or taxes without the council's consent. In most countries, this would have led to disaster, increased decentralization and the nobility doing whatever, picking their noses. Not so much in Sweden. Some attribute it to Gustavus' willpower and charisma. And surely that had an impact, but it was mostly because the Swedish nobility were few, weak and poor. With a powerful state employment, they could make money from a regular wage. The most important part of establishing a successful nation is cooperation between interest groups. Gustavus and nobility now wanted the same thing, expanding the power of the state. Gustavus' biggest help was the chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna. When Gustavus became king at the age of 17, Axel was 27 and already an experienced statesman. According to himself, he was the cold that balanced out the heat of the king, meaning a calmer disposition versus a passionate one. Gustavus once wrote that Axel was a tool given to him by God. Indeed, while Gustavus is credited as the architect of the Swedish Empire, Axel Oxenstierna should receive at least half the credit, probably much more. He was very much the Richelieu, Olivares, or even Bismarck of Sweden. Gustavus and Axel spent the 1610s and 1620s reforming Swedish society. They established universities across the country and her Baltic possessions, such as Estonia. This meant more educated administrators for the government, and that they wouldn't have to go abroad and possibly be converted to Catholicism. They established several new cities and invited immigrants from Germany and the Netherlands to manage Swedish mining and industry. These became especially important in equipping the Swedish military with weaponry. However, neither Jews nor Catholics were allowed in Sweden. Being a papist was punishable by death. Neither was anyone allowed to move out of Sweden. The population was small, and Gustavus needed every soul he could get to pay taxes or serve in the army. When moving around the country, you needed a passport. Cities had limited rights. They weren't allowed to trade with the countryside, since this was hard to tax. Neither could they trade outside of the country. This was done in order to expand the power of Stockholm, which properly became the Swedish capital during Gustavus' reign. If I'd list all of Gustavus' civil reforms, we'd be here all day, and I know you guys want me to get into the military stuff. So, as a summary, Gustavus' civil reforms sought to consolidate the country's meager resources and enhance the power of the state. His policies would last throughout the century, and its consequences was that the nobility flourished, whilst the peasantry suffered.
So, why didn't they just revolt, dude?
Because the peasantry were actually represented in the parliament. Gustavus did his best to appeal to them, and even changed some decisions based on their opinions. On other occasions, he and the nobles just passed decisions without them, such as the doubling of a tax in 1617, I think. Essentially, the Swedish peasantry were given enough of a voice to remain pacified, without their situation actually improving. The propaganda was also very effective, and if anyone got any violent ideas, Gustavus had his new and cool army on the standby to laserize any internal opposition into the dust. And with that, we can finally get into the epic military reforms. The early 1600s wasn't exactly a jolly good time if you were a Swedish soldier. Denmark's mercenaries gave them a good thrashing. In 1605, the Polish winged hussars literally just ran over the Swedes at the Battle of Kirkholm. The army needed some serious refurbishment, and Gustavus knew just where to look. Whilst Gustavus was proud of his royal lineage, his biggest contemporary inspiration came from the Dutch Republic. He admired how the small country had come together to defeat a bigger opponent. The young king read written works of Dutch generals like Moritz of Orange, and even maintained personal contact with them. Gustavus spent his early reign reforming the Swedish army after the Dutch model. Whilst his Catholic enemies fought in massive pike formations called tercios, the Swedes deployed in small but maneuverable units, focused chiefly on firepower. Unlike his Dutch inspirations, he put a bigger emphasis on cavalry and mobile artillery. The key to Gustavian tactics was mobility and firepower. However, tactics shouldn't be given too much credit. When the Danish intervened in the German war, their troops also deployed in the Dutch fashion, and were severely beat by the Imperial Tercios. What made the Swedish army so good were their logistics, training and organization. Rather than having to plunder for nourishment, the army could rely on a steady supply train. Swedish units had a much higher ratio of officers than other contemporary armies, allowing them to maneuver and operate more intelligently. This military administration was reliant on the professional bureaucracy, led by Axel Oxenstierna. Morale was also an incredible factor to the Swedish success. The king himself was well known for his bravado and inspiring speeches, and his army operated under a strict set of articles, where religion was paramount. Since Gustavus is celebrated as the father of modern warfare, there remains much to be said of his armed forces, but I'll keep that for a separate video instead. Perhaps most important was recruitment. Gustavus reformed the old conscription system, obligating every Swedish male for military service at the age of 15. This would have grievous consequences for the Swedish populace. 50,000 Swedish and Finnish soldiers died between 1621 and 1632 alone. In proportion to Sweden's contemporary population of around 1 million, these casualties are comparable to both sides in the American Civil War. You were riding along Gustavus' wild ride, whether you wanted to or not, and he was not stopping anytime soon. First off the bucket list were the Russians. Now, Russia in the 1610s was not much of a threat. They were currently fighting a massive civil war called the Time of Troubles. Sweden had intervened in hopes of installing a Swedish Tsar on the throne. In fact, King Charles had considered Gustavus for his candidate. Imagine that, Tsar Gustavi. Of course, the official reasons behind the war was to defend Sweden against Crazy Ivan, who had competed with Sweden over Estonian and Finnish territories for hundreds of years. Gustavus saw it as an opportunity to claim all of Russia's Baltic coast, thus connecting Finland with Swedish Livonia and securing the valuable Russian trade of fur, naval supplies and grain. This proved a major source of income throughout Sweden's empire, and especially valuable in the years to come. Russia was Orthodox and didn't like the Catholics in Poland or Germany any more than Sweden did. The Russians used trade to economically support the Swedes against a mutual enemy. Though the Russians peaced out pretty easily, being busy with their civil war and stuff, Gustavus took great pride in his victory and celebrated with a bombastic coronation. He hosted a tournament where he himself portrayed the Gothic king, Berik. As aforementioned, Gustavus was obsessed with Gothicism. His office in the Palace of Stockholm was adorned with tapestries depicting the history of the Goths. He owned all of the action figures and never went to sleep without his Magog body pillow. But a body pillow wasn't enough to keep the king company at night. His teachers had often complained that the king spent more time flirting with the ladies than studying. During the Russian campaign, he wrote love letters back home and had a Dutch mistress in camp. Eventually, a priest got fed up and told Gustavus that God would smite him if he ever held hands before marriage. That priest would later become an influential bishop, and Gustavus went on Tinder to find a suitable match. After considerable swiping, he found a chick from Brandenburg, Prussia, named Maria Eleonora. She was pretty cute, and she really liked his carrot beard. After some weird back and forth shenanigans that I can't bother getting into, I know you guys want me to get back into the epic battles after all. They finally got married in 1620. But most importantly, Maria's dad was the ruler of Brandenburg, Prussia. He was an elector count of the Holy Roman Empire, giving Gustavus a powerful ally in Germany. Speaking about Germany, things weren't looking too good over there. Whilst Gustavus was busy hunting for a wife and taxing the peasantry, some Bohemians finally decided it was time to throw 2 Austrian guys out of a window. This sparked a war that killed 30 million people. That's European history for you. Now, things weren't so simple, of course. Those Bohemians were Protestants and were fed up with their Catholic ruler revoking the rights of religion that they had been promised. As a response for this defenestration, the emperor decided to send in his troops to squash the uprising. Now, while this event sparked the war, the conflict had been brewing for decades and had almost broken out at several points before. The reasons included the religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants, the emperor's increasingly tyrannical behavior, Spain's constant meddling in smaller countries, and so on. The local conflict escalated swiftly into an all-out war, and by the time it got going, it was hard to stop. Generals had become powerful warlords, with soldiers, investors, and even civilians that were economically dependent on the war. This conflict was known as the 30 Years' War because it lasted the 30 years between 1618 and 1648. Seriously, who write this crap? A 6-year-old? Now most historians just relegate the war to Germany, but both sides just saw it as one part of a religious conflict involving all European peoples, including the Russians and Turks. The Spanish saw their war against the Dutch as part of it, as did Gustavus with his war in Poland. Oh, how convenient! That segues me into Gustavus' war in Poland. Do you remember Sigismund, the king of Poland and Sweden, that was usurped by Duke Charles? Well, he refused to recognize Gustavus as king, and still claimed the Swedish throne for himself, despite being thrown out by literally everyone. Some guys just can't take a hint, I guess. This allowed Gustavus and Axel to sell their attack on Poland as a defensive conflict. Because if they didn't go over to Poland, Sigismund would fly over to Sweden on a winged hussar, make everyone worship the Pope, and ban the meatballs. The propaganda was very effective, and the peasantry remained complacent. Gustavus' interests were twofold. For one, he wanted Sigismund to sit down, stop saying he was the king of Sweden, and recognize that Gustavus was the real big cheese. Secondly, he wanted to conquer the rest of Livonia. This would give Sweden more control over the Baltic trade. Especially paramount was the city of Riga, situated on the mouth of the Daugava River. Having landed further to the north, Gustavus marched his army south and laid siege to the city. He risked his own life at several occasions. It is said that he took up a shovel himself to dig the trenchworks. He spent most of his time at the front lines. A guy next to him got shot and splattered blood all over the royal garments. A cannonball went right through his tent when he was texting his wife. After less than a month, the city surrendered and was promised extensive rights by Gustavus. He was given the key to the city, and Riga became the largest and most valuable city in Sweden. Gustavus wanted to take the rest of Livonia, but a disease broke out in army camp, preventing offensive operations. Next year, the Poles agreed to an armistice, since they were busy fighting the Turks. Gustavus could spend the time managing internal and private affairs. He and his wife made several attempts to conceive an heir, without any luck. Their first daughter was stillborn, as did their first and only son. She suffered a miscarriage the same day that Gustavus departed for Livonia. She loved him very dearly and was depressed for the long periods he was away from her. Neither did she like Sweden very much. It was cold and grey, and the people on the bus never talked to her. In 1626 she gave birth to her daughter, Kristina, who would become the very controversial Queen of Sweden, but that's a story for another day. Because Gustavus was going back to Poland to kick some butt. Together with Axel, he had established a really nice navy with which to dominate the Baltic Sea, allowing them to transport troops and provisions as they pleased. The Polish navy, on the other hand, was very weak. Gustavus' goal was to conquer all of Livonia, and of course, make Sigismund sit the f*** down. Swedish troops had seized major ports all along Poland's Baltic coast, and won several battles, though the conflict quickly devolved into a lengthy guerrilla war. Gustavus put his own life at risk one too many times. He was crossing the Vistula River in a small boat during a night skirmish, when he was shot in the stomach. The boat was shot to pieces, and he was narrowly got back ashore. The bullet only did minor damage, and he was riding again within a week. At Stum in 1629, he and his troops found themselves surrounded by a larger Polish force. The lads managed to escape into safety, but not after taking severe casualties, including the king's own hat, which the Polish forces took as a trophy and delivered to General Wallenstein, leader of the imperial forces in Germany. Gustavus said of Stum that he had never been in a hotter bath. 2 years earlier, at the Battle of Dirschau, Polish sharpshooters shot him in the shoulder. This made it hard for him to use his right arm, and he struggled at simple tasks such as riding. It rendered him unable to wear plate armor, forcing him to wear instead a leather jerkin made from moose skin. There's hardly anything more Swedish. 5 years later, that wound would bear him fatal consequences. The Polish found themselves outnumbered and outgunned, and resorted to guerrilla tactics and scorched earth. Sigismund remained cocky, since he expected General Wallenstein in Germany to come over any day now and reinforce him. However, Wallenstein and the Imperialists were busy. Since the German Protestants had been severely beaten, England and the Netherlands decided to give the Danish King Christian enough money to hire mercenaries and intervene in the 30 Years' War. Sweden had initially planned on partaking in this attack, but Gustavus had been busy with the Polish War. When Sigismund realized that all was lost, he agreed to a truce. Poland gave Sweden all Livonia and some minor territories in the Baltic, and Sweden was even given some land from its ally in Brandenburg, Prussia. However, Sigismund refused to give up his claims to the Swedish throne. This would lead to much nastier conflicts, culminating in a borderline genocidal war in 1655, called the Swedish Deluge. The war in Poland had been costly. Between 1625 and 29, 50,000 Swedish soldiers had been brought into Poland. 30,000 of those had died, mostly from disease. Still, Gustavus was far from stopping. He and his council were now discussing their intervention in Germany. So the 30 Years' War wasn't exactly a good time for the civilian population, as I might have indicated with the funny introduction. Both sides burned and butchered indiscriminately. Encountering a group of soldiers was equal to a death sentence. Some said the end of days was nigh. In times such as these, oppressed people look anywhere for signs of hope. People saw strange visions of burning angels and mighty armies marching in the sky. Some saw a lion. Astronomers saw strange things happening in the Lion's constellation. A mute regained the ability to speak, his first words being, "The Catholics will be defeated." A prophecy was patched together from biblical passages, speaking of a great avenger that would come from the north to punish the sinful south. Of a roaring lion that would crawl from its den to defeat the great eagle. It was clear who the defeated eagle was. The emperor carried one as his banner. But who was the lion? Many had attempted to don the lion's cloak. First it was Fredrik von Fals, though he was deposed after only ruling Bohemia a short winter, earning him the moniker Der Winterkönig. Then it was Christian IV of Denmark, but his intervention was soundly beaten. In 1629 the Protestants looked further north, to Gustavus Adolphus. The king himself was none too happy to accept that role, and Axel Oxenstierna was very effective at churning out propaganda pieces, depicting his liege as the northern lion, who came down to save the faithful and burn down Rome, the modern Babylon. It was so effective that people believe it to this day. The truth may be more cynical. After Christian peaced out of the war, he met with Gustavus to discuss a potential alliance and mutual intervention. Despite the two countries being mortal enemies, Gustavus really liked Christian, and later wrote that he was one of the few people he'd like as a friend. He even showed Christian where the Polish bullet was lodged in his shoulder. The surgeon was never able to remove it. Gustavus was otherwise quite impolite. Christian thus proved unwilling to cooperate, and never understood why Gustavus wanted to intervene in the war. Gustavus got emotional over this, and listed his reasons in a fit of rage. Firstly, the emperor had illegally deposed the Duke of Mecklenburg, with whom Gustavus was allied. He also spoke of German intrigues at the Polish court. Lastly, German attempts to build a Baltic fleet, thus threatening Sweden's naval dominance and trade power in the region. And that's it. That's what he said. The historian Skybergsson said that it is remarkable that Gustavus Adolphus, in this emotional moment, did not voice the religious reason as a motive behind his German intervention. Gustavus' arguments in parliament pointed in the same direction. German fleets and merchants were harming Swedish trade and maritime dominance. He further argued that I have no other intentions than the well-being of the fatherland. In 1636, Axel Oxenstierna told the council more plainly of his and Gustavus' intentions behind the intervention. Defending the religion was never our main goal. His Royal Majesty had other cases for war. Axel believed that religion should never be fought with worldly weaponry, but with tears and prayers. And plenty of tears and prayers would be said on that fateful day in 1630, when Gustavus bid adieu to the Swedish nation. In his final speech to the parliament, he wished the burghers and peasantry that their huts be turned to great houses of stone, their boats to great ships, and for their money to never run short. With that he bade them farewell. For his queen and daughter, the goodbye was devastating. Previously, the king had battled during summers and returned home in winter to manage internal affairs and spend time with his family. Now he would spend all of his time in the German campaign, and the child would never see her father again. Her last words to him may have come from this letter, which he wrote to him in German. So in all humility, I deliver your highness my heart, Thus, I pray for your majesty to hereby think of me, and return to me soon, and whilst he is absent, to send me something beautiful. I shall always be gentle, and learn to be diligent.
Do not come. Do not come.
I'm gonna come.
The Swedish intervention didn't exactly come out of the blue. Gustavus had wanted to join the Protestant Union in 1614, before the war even started. And as said before, the war in Poland had very much been an extension of the 30 Years' War. German troops from Holstein had come to Polish aid, and a small Swedish contingent had relieved Wallenstein's attack on the city of Stralsund. Interestingly, Wallenstein had offered Gustavus to become an imperial admiral and receive either Norway or Denmark as a gift from the emperor. Axel Oxenstierna found a deal to go against Swedish interests, so he declined. Initially, Gustavus' goals in Germany weren't so ambitious. He sought to restore Pomerania and Mecklenburg to their former leadership. Sweden made major diplomatic efforts in Germany, but no one actually wanted him to intervene. Neither was able to get help from France or Russia. Funnily enough, the only one who approached him was the Khan of Crimea, who offered to attack Poland. After helping out the people of Stralsund, Gustavus was able to use the city as a bridgehead for his invasion force. The city would remain in Swedish hands until 1815. When landing his troops on the island of Peenemünde, he was so eager to get ashore that he jumped out of his boat and tore up the skin on his leg. This image was far from fitting a hero, so in most depictions of the landing we just find him praying at the shoreline. Gustavus marched on the neutral city of Stettin and told Duke Bogislav that the defenses were too weak to hold him off. Bogislav found the argument pretty convincing and submitted, and a Swedish garrison was established. A formal alliance was struck between the two rulers, and Gustavus had made his first base. Despite Sweden being known for its neutrality today, Gustavus was never fond of that standpoint, and would force anyone he encountered to pick a side. After Bogislav died, Stettin became the capital of Swedish Pomerania. Since Gustavus needed money, he decided to sell Pomeranian land to Swedish nobles. The sale of conquered territories is part of the reason why the Swedish nobility became so powerful during this era. In August of 1630, Gustavus signed a doom alliance with the Archbishopric of Magdeburg. The bishop was Protestant, and the emperor was determined to force it back into Catholicism. General Wallenstein, the chief commander of Catholic forces, was against this. He wanted peace as quick as possible, so that a united Germany could fight against the Turkish encroachment in the east. Due to court intrigues, Wallenstein was deposed during this time, meaning one less frightful opponent for Gustavus to face. However, instead of relieving Magdeburg, Gustavus went in the opposite direction to seek a decisive battle against the Catholics. By this point, the king was no longer the fit and handsome young gentleman. His hairline had receded, and as one Swedish historian famously put it, he had grown quite fat. Befitting his Baroque appearance, he was both passionate and energetic, loud and jovial. But in a letter to Axel Oxenstierna, he reflected on his 20 years of rulership. He had suffered many hardships, but did so for the well-being of the fatherland and the duty given by God. However, he begged for Axel to watch over his wife and daughter. Things turned bright on Christmas Day, when the Swedes attacked Greifenhagen. The Catholics were soundly beaten, and the Swedes were able to plunder food and alcohol to celebrate the occasion. The victory was great for Swedish propaganda, which was working hard to spread the word of the Lion of the North, there to liberate the Protestant faithful. Gustavus was growing increasingly ambitious. In 1631, he wanted 5 great armies to attack the emperor. Axel had to remind him of the economic realities. Sweden just didn't have the cash. Then, out of literally nowhere, a French delegation manifested itself from the dimension of France. Gustavus had him kicked out in a fit of rage. When the Frenchies promised him an alliance and a yearly contribution of 400,000 riksdaler, the king changed his mind. That was a third of Sweden's annual income. A dark pact was struck. However, the two sides had troubles agreeing on religious issues. The French wanted full religious rights for Catholics, which Gustavus was completely against. Ironically, he had tried to force religious rights for Protestants in Poland, but refused to do the same for Catholics or Orthodox Christians in Sweden. In the end, Gustavus agreed to let the Catholics hold Mass wherever they had done so before. The Franco-Swedish alliance would continue long after the end of Sweden's empire, and Sweden would far too often be bribed by the French to act like a rabid pit bull on French opponents. Catholic forces had been delegated to another skilled commander, the Duke of Tilly. Having marched his army to the frozen river of Varte, the two opponents now stood face to face, but neither wanted to attack. Gustavus himself had other plans. At one point he wanted to inspect the enemy's defenses and decided to go out on the ice. It cracked under him from his massive weight and he fell into the water. The enemy saw him and opened fire, but he refused any help and eventually got up all by himself. He got into safety, changed clothes, had lunch, and went back out on the ice. The two opponents had parted ways and Gustavus conquered several forts along the river. He took the city of Frankfurt, and even though the denizens were mostly Protestant, he allowed his soldiers to plunder it as they pleased. Meanwhile, the city of Magdeburg finally fell to the Catholic forces. The aftermath was one of the most horrific incidents of the war. The commander was unable to stop his troops from their orgy of violence. The incident was very embarrassing for Gustavus, since he had repeatedly promised to relieve the city. Propaganda said that Gustavus had just handed the city over to the Catholics. After Magdeburg, Tilly and Gustavus went separate ways. Gustavus went to visit his brother-in-law, the Prince of Brandenburg-Prussia, George Wilhelm of Hohenzollern. Since the Hohenzollerns were Reformed, not Protestant, they remained neutral in the conflict. And we know what Gustavus thought about neutrality. After using his army to blockade George's castles and giving him personally a sound scolding, Gustavus was able to force them to pay a juicy tribute. Brandenburg had barely an army at this point and just wasn't able to fight back. But George's descendants learned from this hard lesson. In the coming decades, they reformed their country into one of the most militarized nations in Europe, Prussia. The Protestant state of Saxony had initially been friendly towards the emperor.
Cringe.
But in August of 1631, the emperor decided to take hostile action towards the neutral state. A Catholic army under the Count of Tilly had been sent to deal with them. Saxony and Sweden were quick to sign an alliance, and Gustavus was made a commander of their combined army, consisting of 41,000 Swedes and Saxons. Whilst the Swedes were well-trained veterans, the Saxon army was a desperate force, hastily mustered to counter Tilly's extensive looting. The two armies met outside the city of Leipzig, near the manor of Breitenfeld. Tilly's Catholic forces had the advantage. The battlefield was flat and open, which were favorable for their clumsy imperial tercios. Their heavy cavalry, called cuirassiers, could ride freely, and their artillery had full line of sight. The sun was also behind them, and the wind was at their backs. Numerically, they were slightly inferior to the Protestants. Things started out ugly for the Protestants. After an artillery duel, Tilly's forces engaged the Saxon infantry and forced them to retreat. The Catholics now had the upper hand. But thanks to their superior discipline, the Swedish forces were unfazed by their allies retreating. They sustained repeated assaults. Cooperation between infantry and cavalry was key. As Gustavus had said, a country united stands stronger. The great firepower of the infantry allowed crushing cavalry charges. The Swedes conquered the enemy artillery and used it to bombard their own side. In the confusion, the imperial cavalry retreated. Tilly himself was almost captured. At 7 in the evening, the battle was over, and the Catholics in full retreat. What could have ended in disaster ended instead with an astonishing victory. Tilly's losses were crushing, and prisoners were forced to join the Swedish regiments. Gustavus had spent the battle riding through the front lines without any armor whatsoever, whilst bullets and cannonballs whistled around him. This only contributed to the myth around him, and the propaganda machine was quick to capitalize. 80 different flyers were distributed across Germany. Before then, the Protestants had fought a losing battle. Now, their savior was here. The lion had come. I talked before about Sweden's reasons for getting into the war. Primarily they were economic, but we shouldn't fail to talk about prestige. Gustavus lived by a warlike ideology derived from the Old Testament and Gothicism, both of which celebrated heroic victories in battle. Axel Oxenstierna himself spoke of reputatio, reputation, as being very important, which Sweden would win in offensive conflicts abroad. Before Gustavus, Sweden had been utterly insignificant, a fact which was often mocked in foreign propaganda. This national egoism had further been hurt when Wallenstein had been titled General of the Baltic Sea. In his war manifest of 1630, Gustavus stated that Sweden had a special right to dominate the Baltic Sea, their Domini Mares Baltici. Some historians say that the economic reasons were only a short-term motivation. They would help with funding military expansion, the victors of which being the growth of national prestige. The Swedes felt like princes of the world as they marched victoriously from their glory at Breitenfeld. The North German states had essentially become Swedish vassals and were obliged to make financial contributions to Gustavus' army. If a city surrendered, Gustavus let them keep their privileges. If it resisted, it was conquered and a new government established, consisting of local Protestants loyal to his German military state. Sometimes he gave cities to his allies, or even to his own generals. Gustavus believed he had full right to make sweeping changes in conquered territories. He often quoted the book De Jure Belli ac Pacis, on the rights of war and peace, on how a conqueror should behave. He even made up a new term, ius superioritatis, the right of superiority, which gave the king the right to intervene in literally anything. The king meaning, of course, him. Gustavus directed a small detachment to conquer the rest of the German coast, while he took the bulk of his army and marched south, directly into the imperial heartlands. In December of 1631, Gustavus conquered the city of Mainz. Under his leadership, the city became a center of international diplomacy. He ordered the construction of Gustavsburg, a near impregnable star fortress. In January the next year, his dear wife came personally and visited him. The reunion must have been touching. With her was the Chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna. For the coming years, Mainz would be the Chancellor's base of operations. The king had become marginally more tolerant towards Catholics. Whilst they were excluded from high bureaucratic positions and were forced to pay the biggest toll to his armies, he allowed their freedom of worship and recruited many into his armies. At one point he even attended a Catholic mass. Like a true Protestant, he found it ridiculous that the priest did not follow what was written in the Bible to a T. He did, however, admit a fascination with the Jesuits, and said he'd follow them if he was a Catholic. This sudden tolerance was partly out of necessity, partly out of obligation from his alliance with France. However, the French didn't always find him a pleasant ally. Whilst Axel Oxenstierna was more calm and collected in his diplomatic dealings, Gustavus was not. He refused their request to restore Catholic dominions in Germany. At one point, he even threatened France with war. Gustavus had not calmed down whatsoever. Bad temper was in his dynastic blood, really. In one incident, he beat a young noble until his sword broke into 3 pieces. The noble had refused to serve him food, since his hand was hurt. Gustavus then ordered the father to be punished as well, since he was responsible for raising such a brat. His wife and court found this rather embarrassing, and appealed to Gustavus for forgiveness. However, it is possible that Gustavus felt bad over incidents like these. An English diplomat wrote that Gustavus said he couldn't lord over his own emotions. When he got upset, he forgot what he did and said, and could later regret it. He hoped that God and the world could forgive him. Obviously, Gustavus had long since fulfilled his initial goals of restoring his deposed allies and taking the German coast. What were his current plans? Well, all the success had bloated his ego. Diplomats and princes found him intolerably prideful and overly ambitious. He tried to become elected the new king of Poland. He had hopes for a personal union with Brandenburg-Prussia. Whilst he didn't succeed in either of those, he did come close to his ultimate ambition. That goal was to build a Protestant union, the Corpus Evangelicorum. Gustavus would be crowned emperor. Gustavus's adventures brought him as far south as Bavaria. A Swedish diplomat wrote how the Finnish cavalrymen, used to feeding on moldy bread and beer soup in Livonia, could now cook cold soup in their helmets, with wine and puff pastry. The French wanted Gustavus to spare Bavaria, but he just told him he didn't care. He could face both the French and the Emperor. Bavaria had not seen war for 128 years. Now the Swedes plundered and destroyed the towns and cities as they pleased. One man paid the Swedes to leave him alone, but they later returned, robbed, and burned him alive. The Germans spoke of something called Soldatenglück, soldier's fortune. A soldier would find great success, but then there would come a point when these fortunes would turn. Whilst Gustavus was out surveying the field, a cannonball hit his horse and killed it instantly. The horse was taken as a trophy, and has since been displayed in a museum at Ingolstadt. It is called Der Schwedenschimmel. Gustavus' old enemy, the Count of Tilly, passed away after sustaining a bullet wound in the leg. Whilst Gustavus had sent a doctor to help Tilly, it now looked as if he wouldn't face any serious opposition. His next goal was to find and defeat the Prince of Bavaria. But instead of meeting Gustavus in the field, the Bavarians walked around him and marched north. Now Gustavus got worried. They were meeting with another imperial army, led by none other than Wallenstein. The emperor had realized how much he needed the legendary mercenary, and had reinstated him and given him complete control over the imperial army. Gustavus was able to catch the Bavarians, and the two Catholic armies met up and united. Gustavus was forced to move through a country which had been completely devastated by the war. To avoid starvation, he was forced to attack. The battle went on for 3 days and ended indecisively. The Swedes had taken the most losses, but no one was the victor. However, Gustavus' reputation of invincibility had gone up in flames. Disaster stacked upon disaster. Soldiers died from starvation and disease, their corpses lining the fields. When Protestant peasants rebelled in Austria, Gustavus marched south, but soon had to turn east. He told his troops to cheer up, and for the marching bands to keep playing. But most of all, he wanted them to fear him more than the enemy. One of his commanders had capitulated and was made an example. Decapitation for insubordination. Both Wallenstein and Gustavus' armies had marched up to the river Saale. It was now November, cold and rainy. Wallenstein had set up winter camp. When Gustavus learned of this, he decided to attack. His goal was to surprise the Imperials when their army was divided over a large area. However, the Swedes were discovered, and Wallenstein was able to muster his forces. The Imperials entrenched outside the city of Lützen in Saxony. The attackers had to cross deep ditches and a stream, Flossgraben. The only advantage was that the Swedes had slightly more men. At 5 in the morning, the Swedes made ready to march. But the fog was so thick that they couldn't see anything. A preacher named Jacob Fabricius held a mass, and Gustavus held 2 speeches, one for the Swedes and one for the Germans. When they finally marched towards Lützen, the Imperialists had set it on fire. The scene must have been apocalyptic, and thanks to all the fog, they weren't able to attack until 11 AM. To their dismay, they didn't find any clumsy Imperial tercios. Wallenstein had drilled and deployed his troops in the Swedish manner. The Swedish infantry saw initial success, but a mad charge by Croatian cavalry forced them back. The fog was thickening. Gustavus himself rallied a unit of cavalry and rode against the Croatians, but in the fog and powder smoke, he was separated from his men. His sight had never been so good. A bullet struck him in the arm, and his horse was killed. Quickly, his page gave him a new horse, but as he mounted up, he was shot in the back. The horse carried him off a distance, before Gustavus finally fell in the mud. The page tried to get him up, but, as you might have noticed, the king was a big boy and quite heavy. He wouldn't budge. A group of cuirassiers arrived and asked the page who it was in the mud. "It's an officer," the page said. Well, they asked the officer who he was, and Gustavus replied, "Ich bin der König von Schweden." I am the king of Sweden. The cuirassiers wanted to take him captive, but not even they were strong enough to lift him. In a fit of frustration, one of them stabbed him through the heart. Next they killed the page and wandered off. Gustavus was still alive. Next came an Italian commander. He recognized Gustavus. The Italians took his jerkin, ring and necklace. They shot him in the temple and left him face down in the filth. Fighting continued until 7 PM, when Wallenstein had enough and pulled back. Technically, it was a Swedish victory. But that night, the exhausted, starved survivors could do nothing but lie down in the mud, next to the corpses of 5,000 comrades. The next day, they were delivered the grim news. Gustavus' moose jerkin was taken as a trophy to Austria. After the First World War, Austria gave it back to Sweden as a thanks for donations to Austrian children. Today it can be seen in Livrustkammaren, an armory museum in Stockholm. The morning after the battle, Gustavus' body was discovered and taken to a nearby church. Here it was washed and transported to a bigger city for embalming. Gustavus' daughter would keep his heart as a sort of memory, which sounds weird today, but was quite common in the 1600s. His body was eventually brought back to Stockholm, where it was buried after a lengthy ceremony. So, what was the king like as a person? As you might have realized, he was well known for his hot temperament. But he was known to switch just as dramatically. During one night, he rose 4 separate times to toast the Prince of Brandenburg. Earlier in the night, he had threatened him with war. During his stay in Frankfurt am Main, it was said that he was so loud, happy and courageous that he couldn't even feel sorrow. He was very inspiring, and Sweden wouldn't hear a speaker to rival him, until King Gustav III in the late 1700s. Of course, he was very prideful. He believed that Sweden was the new Israel, and that he was the descendant of the Gothic warlords that had conquered the world. He spent almost 10 years fighting in Poland because the Polish king wouldn't recognize him as the King of Sweden. When the emperor wrote to him a letter with the wrong title, he sent it back without even opening. Part of the reason he intervened in the 30 Years' War was because Wallenstein had been named General of the Baltic Sea, a title which only the Swedish king could claim. What about his religion? As we learned, his goal in Germany wasn't to protect the oppressed Protestants, despite the propaganda and pretenses. He was even willing to ally the Muslim Turks and attack the Catholic Austrians together. But that doesn't mean he wasn't religious, as we found proven on multiple occasions. He said himself that his interest was the well-being of Sweden, but it is likely that he didn't see a difference between Sweden and its king. Glory for Sweden would mean glory for him. If he had only been out for the well-being of the country, he would have signed a peace after his early victories in northern Germany, not marched south with the ambition of becoming a Protestant emperor. This wasn't even in the interest of the Protestants. Most of the princes were quite pacifistic and far from Gustavus' militancy. He ruled Sweden for 19 years. During 15 of those, he was at war. It is hard to judge a person that lived 300 years ago, under circumstances so different from ours. Did Gustavus do right, or did he do wrong? What would he have been like today? A family man? A father? Or what would you and I have been like, had we been given his responsibility and authority? Every person has a bright side, and a dark side. It is circumstance which evokes either of them. The idea that Gustavus was the Lion of the North kinda collapsed when he died. Who was supposed to save the Protestants now? Well, the propaganda was modified to say that it were the Swedes themselves that were the lion, not just their dead king. However, the war quickly lost its religious aspect and evolved into a conflict of land, money and power. In January of 1633, Sweden and its allies created the Heilbronn Union, with Axel Oxenstierna as its director. Whilst Gustavus' daughter was but a child, Sweden would be ruled by a regency council, with Axel as its leader. With his iron will, Sweden was able to continue the war. French subsidies increased, and the French eventually decided to join the war directly, rather than just scheming in the shadows. Brandenburg and Saxony finally turned on their old ally. This led to a brutal retaliation, with Brandenburg being plundered and spent. Most of Sweden's other allies turned on them. In 1644, the Swedes additionally launched a surprise attack on Denmark and seized major territory. The lengthy regency showed just how powerful the nobility had become in Sweden, and how inseparable their interests were with the ruling dynasty. They were able to continue the war for an additional 15 years, on a much grander and more brutal scale. Great plunder was carried home to fund the Baroque construction of private palaces. Peace was finally signed in 1648, but it wouldn't last long. In a streak of irony, the Queen, Gustavus' own daughter, decided to abdicate and convert to Catholicism. The new king was a glory hound in Gustavus' vein, and would take the country on another wild ride in Poland and Denmark. The so-called Swedish Empire would spend most of its existence at war, and demand a continuous sacrifice of Swedish blood. If you enjoy the content I produce, consider supporting me monetarily on Patreon. You'll find the link in the video description. Otherwise, please give the video a like and a comment, so that YouTube will show it to more potential viewers. And why not share it with a friend? Cheers.